Hello and welcome to the lecture for week 7 of this course, and today we're going to be talking about Erich Fromm, who was born in Germany to an Orthodox Jewish family in 1900, became a member of the Frankfurt School in the 1930s, and studied as a psychoanalyst and a social theorist, and was also very well versed in philosophy and a lot of the social sciences. He was very eclectic and had a wide range of interests. And so this essay that we're looking at today was published by Fromm in the 1960s, in 1963. And it's a very famous essay that is very much bound up with the kind of the spirit of the 1960s, as we'll see, and we'll talk about some of those connections. And also Fromm is giving us a very kind of broad idea of the value of disobedience. As we'll see, most of the works we're focusing on are focused on civil disobedience and the question of law. Fromm is a little different because he's talking about the value of experience, of disobedience in general. And that comes from his unique perspective in psychology. And that unique perspective is bound up with Fromm's humanism, which I'll talk about a little bit today. So Fromm's humanism is his commitment to a kind of very much a sort of positive view of human beings, of people as being self-expressing, self-discovering, self-realizing, self-fulfilling, and all of that kind of comes from internal growth and development. So Fromm has a sort of this characteristic humanistic view that's very much opposed to forms of social, political, and legal authority that kind of put human beings into these sort of fixed categories and determine and coerce their choices. Fromm's a sort of big believer in the power of human growth and self-fulfillment, and you'll see how that comes out in his theory of disobedience. So it's a very wide-ranging theory of disobedience. As I said, it's linked up with the very much the kind of the ethos of the 1960s. So we'll talk about some of those things as we go through. So the sort of context in which Fromm is writing at this time in 1963. So there's a lot of talk about at this time of what's called the conformist society, and this is really based on the sort of structure of work and the sort of broader structure of life in this particular period, where work was done in large bureaucratic top-down institutions that had a lot of hierarchy, a lot of organization and control. But these were schools were other large sort of institutions, large sort of psychiatric institutions and hospitals for sort of healthcare purposes, and other sort of large unions were sort of at this time trade unions were large institutions that sort of represented masses of people. So this is the sort of structure of the general character of sort of public life at this time was the existence of these large institutions that had a lot of hierarchy, and that meant that sort of individual sort of growth and freedom was kind of constrained by all these different factors and these forms of hierarchy and the authority that worked through these institutions to sort of compel forms of obedience. And of course this becomes the worry for Fromm, this idea of obedience, the idea of conformity, is producing these great moral dangers that haven't really been seen before in human history, because the kind of institutions in which people were pressed into mass conformity didn't really exist before maybe the sort of mid-19th and early 20th centuries. And of course, the great war machines of the First World War and the Second World War were very much of this kind. They were large bureaucratic institutions, hierarchically organized, people sort of treated like, almost like mass commodities. They were sort of shipped from one place to the other. So this is very much the kind of the character the character of hierarchy in this kind of society. And the book by William H. White sort of expresses a lot of these fears. I think it was published in 1958. It's called The Organization Man, and it sort of led to a lot of works of this kind that looked at this sort of idea of conformity, and a number of studies as well that came up as a result of this also. Now, at the end of his short essay, Fromm mentions Adolf Eichmann, who was executed in Jerusalem in the early 1960s, I believe. It was 1961. And he mentions Eichmann because he was a bureaucrat during the Nazi period in Germany, and became a kind of high-ranking bureaucrat over time. He fled to Argentina after the war and was found by the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad. He was brought to Jerusalem, and there was a very famous, very public trial that happened in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann's famous defense of the things that he did was he said he was just following orders, right? So this is the this again sort of taps into this idea of conformity and hierarchy, and the idea, and this is sort of what Fromm's picking up on here, that these sort of acts of evil are happening today, not because people are, people are being crazy evil and doing these sort of evil things, and there's a lot of sort of direct hatred and direct violence and all of this stuff. It's much more that things, evil things that are happening in the context of these large organizations that are based on hierarchy and order. And when the goals that those institutions pursue are not moral, then we find outcomes that are sort of that are worse than sort of ordinary attempts of evil because of the extent of the power behind these institutions. Eichmann became a high-ranking Nazi officer. He worked at the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Vienna, and eventually he created the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which was responsible for organizing the placement of Jews firstly in ghettos, and ultimately arranged the sort of gradual exportation of Jews to the death camps. Now, while he was doing this, of course, Eichmann was fulfilling this bureaucratic job of sort of collecting passports and deciding how to stamp passports and all of these kind of bureaucratic decisions that were going on. So it's not as though it's not as though he was directly pulling the trigger. It's not as though he was committing violence. It's not as though you could describe him as bloodthirsty. And yet the role he played in this sort of system of evil was very profound, right? But he did it in the context of this chain of command. So there's a very famous book that Hannah Arendt writes in the wake of the Eichmann trial called Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she uses this very famous phrase in this book where she refers to Eichmann and much of sort of the sort of Nazi Nazi regime. She captures under this phrase of the banality of evil, right? Which is it's a strange phrase because banality is kind of it's ordinary, it's low, it's meaningless, it's kind of it's not important. And so there's this idea of evil that's sort of ordinary, that flows through just obeying orders, going through chains of command, that doesn't require any great bloodthirstiness or any great hatred or any great violence. So this is the kind of context that Fromm is talking about when he talks about the danger of obedience, this kind of new context in which it's forms of obedience in these sort of very immoral systems, these very immoral institutions organized by sort of hierarchy and obedience, where people feel unable and afraid to say no when they're asked to do something that sort of sounds like it's wrong or sounds like it's immoral. So it creates this structure that sort of has massive power to do evil, and nobody within the structure seems to have the sort of personal power to resist what's happening. So Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram, who was active at this time, was influenced by the Eichmann trial. And after this, he began to do a series of highly influential experiments on the nature of obedience and authority. So basically, what Milgram did was he took college students and he would sort of set them up as the subject. You can see in this experiment the subject who administers shocks to this test subject. So typically they were told something like, we're testing memory, we're testing this other subject's responses to see how their memory can be improved by giving them electric shocks. And so what happened was, over time the subject would be encouraged to give even greater electric shocks. Of course, it was completely fake. There was no actual shocking taking place, but the test subject, who was sort of in on it with the experimenter, was pretending to be shocked and pretending to be in pain. And so the experimenter is the person in authority who's wearing the white coat, who sort of represents the institutional authority that sort of overrides individual judgment about right and wrong. So the experimenter is saying, keep going, and the subject is sort of saying, well, this person's in pain, should I keep going? And the experimenter said, yes, keep going. And so Milgram's these experiments were very very shocking when they became public, because they appeared to confirm that a person and a subject to authority, to the authority of somebody else who seems to be an authoritative person, will keep going and sort of keep doing things that seem obviously immoral, including shocking a subject when they seem to be in obvious pain, and they take it to very severe extremes. So most of them kept going until the sort of pain dial was on the severe end of the spectrum. So again, it talks to this context of people who are subject to authority and lose their sense of moral judgment when they are subject to authority telling them what to do. So this is what Fromm sees happening as well in in the sort of post-war period coming into the 1960s. That there's these mass institutions that are promoting obedience, and this isn't leading to a more moral, freer society. This is leading to the greater likelihood and greater propensity that people are going to be involved in acts of evil, and doing things that are going to cause massive human suffering. So other things here that are relevant when Fromm is writing in the early 1960s. One thing that's just starting to emerge here is this growth of what's come to be called a post-scarcity mindset, right? And this means that a new focus on environmental well-being, personal happiness, social equality, gender equality, and meaningful work. So the basic idea is when it comes to a time when we don't have to be preoccupied with finding food and focusing on survival all the time, we start to focus on these sort of new post-scarcity things. So people are just beginning in the 1960s to think about environmental well-being, to think about personal happiness in a kind of broader sense than sort of personal possessions, social equality among different groups, whether sex and race and those kind of categories, and the idea of meaningful work, and what meaningful work involves and how it can be acquired. So there's certainly a strong influence here of the civil rights movement, which was pushing for racial equality, and the women's movement, which has started to emerge and was now pushing for gender equality. So all of that is inspiring Fromm's sort of humanist thinking that people will sort of push for things that lead to their own fulfillment, and the kind of resistance and disobedience that these groups are showing in bringing their own cause forward. That's going to lead to sort of social growth, and lead to a sort of a more humanist and a society better able to meet people's needs. Anti-colonial movements in the developing world similarly are agitating for freedom from Western control, and so all these movements for freedom that are happening, Fromm sees this new movement for disobedience that's sort of rising up against these, the sort of social conformity that we just talked about and this sort of institutional authority, and all these new movements are kind of are attempting to bring forward this new idea of social growth, of how people can kind of create their own, people can create a new society that's more equal, that's freer, that sort of focuses on different new forms of happiness. So all of this is sort of playing into the opposition that Fromm develops between obedience and disobedience, where it's disobedience as sort of envisaged as seen in these sort of new social movements that is really pushing society forward in a more progressive and advanced direction. Okay, let's take a look at the opening analogy in Fromm's essay, and it's about Adam and Eve and the original act of disobedience. And it sets out Fromm's idea, and this is kind of just a speculative history that lies behind everything he's really saying about disobedience. But it's worth sort of taking a look at it, because it sort of gives us a nice perspective for making sense of it, I think. And what Fromm's doing here is basically turning upside down the traditional Adam and Eve story and the Garden of Eden. And of course, according to the traditional story, it's Adam and Eve, and by implication humanity, are sort of punished for the sin in the Garden of Eden of disobedience, of disobeying God, and they're punished for that by being expelled from the world. In this picture here, we see the expulsion from paradise, and so the sort of story of the Garden of Eden is often taken in this sense as a kind of story about a sort of warning about disobedience, and specifically of disobedience of God, and how that led to all these terrible repercussions. Right. So when Fromm reads this story, he sort of turns it upside down, and the key point to see here is that for Fromm, when humanity is in the Garden of Eden in the shape of Adam and Eve, what's important to see is that they are not fully human yet, right? And we'll talk about this in a second, but this is a sort of centerpiece of his thinking, that the idea of, we're not human just as a fact, right? We're human as a result of a history that we've gone through, a process of becoming that's made us who we are, right? We may have been physically equipped to be humans, thousands and thousands of years ago, but it's not just a physical thing. It's about all the kind of techniques and attributes and capabilities that we've acquired over the course of history, and of course that involves our knowledge of science and mathematics and philosophy and religion and everything else, right? So as Fromm sees it, human history is a process of growth, as we'll talk about in a second. Right. So the assumption here is that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, humanity is not really human yet. They're kind of in a pre-human state. They're sort of they still have to undergo a process of growth, right? So the start of human history, the expulsion from paradise for Fromm, it's a positive moment, because it's actually a moment of birth. It's being set free from the umbilical cord. Right, so being in the Garden of Eden is like being in the womb, right? We don't have to do anything because everything's there for us. We don't have to develop our capabilities. We don't have to develop our capacities for work. We don't have to develop our minds because everything's easy and everything's given to us, right? So it's only when we get over that stage that we can actually grow. And so this is sort of Fromm's idea that original sin, that's the thing that sort of starts human history, because it sets humans free. it sets humans free to start this process of growth where they're going to sort of use their own capabilities in history to grow as a species, to develop more powers and capabilities. And so that's the positive reading of the Garden of Eden story that sort of starts Fromm's reading of history. We can break this distinction down into two different pieces, and this is really the analogy that Fromm's using and developing, right? He's going to use the idea of the growth of a human being from a newborn to a fully developed adult. That's the idea of ontogenetic growth. And he's using that to make sense of the idea of phylogenetic growth, which is the growth of the species through the course of history. So we refer to ontogenetic development to refer to the growth of a human being from a fetus to a fully developed adult. Phylogenetic development is the growth of the species through the course of history. So what Fromm does is he looks at these two and he says that the ontogenetic development, which as a psychologist and psychoanalyst is, that's sort of his bread and butter work, that idea of growth, is using that idea to understand this idea of history, and history, the sort of phylogenetic growth, the growth of the species through the course of historical development. So now, when he asks himself, when he thinks about how do what is this process of human growth, right? How does it happen from a newborn to a fully developed adult? What's key to one of the key things, the most key thing to ontogenetic growth for Fromm is the idea that we grow by kind of distancing and separating ourselves from caregivers, right? So at different stages of the growth process, whether we're 2 years old and having tantrums, or we're sort of teenagers and sort of being obstinate and stubborn and sort of pushing back, all of that for Fromm is part of this natural process where we grow by separating ourselves from people we depend on, our sort of primary caregivers. So growth is about sort of finding our own way by this process of resistance, opposition, and even what we could call disobedience, where we sort of learn to be ourselves. So, the sort of process of being a teenager and the sort of teenager-parent relationship is always very fraught for that reason, because it's supposed to be that way, because it's a process of tension, because the process of tension aids that process of separation, and it's the process of separation that leads to growth, right? So you can't become a fully developed adult without going through that struggle with an authority figure as a teenager, and also as a 2-year-old, and all the way throughout the process, where you're sort of struggling to assert your independence, and you're struggling to assert the fact that you think for yourself, you sort of have your own life and you have your own ideas, and that has to be sort of worked out during the process of growth. All right, so what Fromm does is he takes that and applies it to the course of history, and he says what happens in human history is very similar, right? We grow when we sort of throw off forms of authority that are that we've sort of overgrown, that are no longer useful to us, right? Just when a teenager finally grows up and they reach maturity, those that kind of back and forth, that sort of parental expectation is no longer necessary. The growth process has happened. So we throw off sort of forms of authority in the course of history that don't really match up to where we are. So we develop more democratic forms of society that give people a greater voice, because now we have the powers and the capabilities to sort of deal with that. Even in the course of democracy, we're still sort of pushing for sort of more people to be included, more groups to be included. And again, that's sort of pushing against the restrictions that authority has put on democratic society. So for Fromm, this is the same sort of process. We're growing as a species, we're growing as a society by kind of pushing back against authority, like the civil rights movement is doing in the 1960s, like the feminist movement is doing in the 1960s, and they're pushing back against authority in order to make happen this process of social growth. So Fromm argues that what is crucial in both ontogenetic and phylogenetic history, growth of the individual and the growth of the species, is this process of disobeying and resisting authority figures in order to secure growth and development, right? So we grow and develop by saying no to authority. In doing that, we're able to secure our own kind of growth, whether it's at the individual level, which we all go through individually, but we all go through it collectively as well as a species as we grow through the process of sort of back and forth and resistance and disobedience in history. Okay, now let's take a look at three sets of distinctions that Fromm makes in this essay. And the general point of these three distinctions is really to sort of make clear when obedience is sort of necessary and when disobedience is a good thing. So basically what he's saying is, not every act of disobedience is a positive sort of growth thing. It may be just a negative form of acting out, right? And I guess you can say that for teenagers as well, right? Not every no is a sort of positive growth sort of no, I can do this myself. Sometimes a teenage no is also a sort of petulant no as well. So it's not, so we can't just say every act of disobedience is positive or every act of disobedience is growth. So Fromm's going to work towards sort of clearing up and sort of narrowing down that distinction a little bit here. So the first one to start with is autonomous and heteronomous obedience, right? So two forms of obedience. So heteronomous obedience, from hetero, which is the Greek word for other. This is obedience to another person, an institution, or another power. So in heteronomous obedience, I am governed by a foreign will that is not my own. Again, it could be in work, an institution is telling me what to do. It could be a police officer is telling me what to do. But those are all examples of heteronomous obedience. Autonomous obedience, from the word auto, the Greek word auto, which means self. Autonomous obedience is an affirmation of my own conviction and judgment. I am simply obeying myself, right? So the point here about autonomous obedience, so we're not obeying a sort of foreign will here, we're just affirming our own conviction, right? But to talk of it as autonomous obedience is important because the idea of autonomy involves two separate things, right? It's the self and it's the idea of law or rule. And that's the word nomos, which we've come across before, right? So autonomy is literally self-rule. So it's more elevated and more refined an idea than just doing whatever I choose to do, right? It's not so much about personal choice, although it is partly about that. It's about the fact that I obey my own reason, or I obey my own conviction, right? I act from a rule that I give to myself, right? So the point of this is I don't just act on whatever comes to me at the moment, right? If I'm feeling angry, if I'm feeling vindictive, right? I don't just act on my anger and vindictiveness. I try to act on the basis of principles that I endorse, right? So that's the idea of autonomy. I'm acting in a rule-governed way, right? And even when I'm feeling like I don't really want to do that, I'm still going to do that because I'm autonomous, I'm governed by my own sense of principle, my own sort of applying the rule to myself. So that's the idea of autonomy. It's sort of obeying yourself in the sense that I'm giving myself the principles by which I act. And because I'm reasonable, I'm rational, I don't just act from whatever occurs to me at the moment. I act on the basis of principles that I endorse regardless of what I'm feeling at any particular time. So that's an important concept. All right, so the second distinction that Fromm talks about is the authoritarian conscience and the humanistic conscience. As you'll see, it's a similar kind of opposition. It's sort of disobedience against the idea of sort of being true to ourselves and obeying ourselves. So the authoritarian conscience, Fromm equates this to the Freudian superego. So for Freud, and whether or not you've studied Freud, it doesn't matter. The Freudian superego is basically the internalized voice of social authority, right? Or more specifically, it's the internalized voice of the father, who is the voice within the family for Freud of social authority, right? So that's the voice that tells you don't put your hand in the cookie jar. Not the voice of the self, it's not your voice, but it's the internalized voice of social control that's sort of telling you, sort of bringing forth the commands of the parents, the father, and beyond that, through them, the sort of broader social authority that you're supposed to obey. Humanistic conscience, in contrast, is what Fromm describes as the voice that calls us back to ourselves, to our humanity. Right? So it's not speaking from the position of social authority. It's not the voice of the father telling us what to do, how we should behave, how we should act. It's our intuitive knowledge of what is human and what promotes human flourishing. Right? So again, it's another opposition of terms based on whether something is sort of representing a voice of social authority, or whether something is sort of representing our sort of instinctive, intuitive sense of our own humanity, and sort of calling us back to that idea of humanity and calling us back to the idea of growth. And you can see very clearly for Fromm what gets in the way of that growth is social authority and the commands that sort of that make us obey for the needs of society rather than for the needs of the self. All right, so the third and final set of distinctions that Fromm makes is the distinction between rational and irrational authority. And he gives us some nice clear examples of how these work. And this is really the sort of, here we can see clearly for Fromm how not all authority is irrational, that we can't sort of simply say authority per se is irrational and we need to get rid of it. That there's sort of legitimate authority and authority that does sort of promote our interests as well. But there's also something called irrational authority that does not promote our interests. And that's the kind of authority we want to resist and disobey and try to sort of change and transform. So Fromm's sort of example of rational authority is the teacher and the student. So the teacher is in a position of authority, obviously with relation to the student. The teacher sets the terms of what is to be studied. The teacher sets and writes the syllabus. The teacher sets the assignments, what the student is going to study and how they're going to be graded, right? And the student just has to accept that this is the way that things are, right? So there's a kind of there's an authority that the teacher is using here, but Fromm says that because the interests of both the teacher and the student lie in the same direction, the teacher is exercising rational authority. And that means in exercising authority, the teacher is serving the interests of the student, i.e. the teacher is serving the needs for growth and learning of the student, right? So those are interests that the student has as a student, right? Those are sort of the student's own human interests. And in serving those interests, being a rational authority, the teacher is sort of serving the student, right? So this is how it works when authority is sort of doing what it's supposed to do, according to Fromm. It's not exploiting the student for some sort of separate interest. It's not making the student give up their growth and their development in order to sort of make them do some task or some work or some industry that they're kind of that they're not really interested in or qualified for, or that doesn't sort of promote their growth in any way. So both the teacher and the student are on the same page and working together to help the student grow. In contrast, an irrational authority, and the example that Fromm gives here is a master and slave relationship. The interests of both are antagonistic. So the master's interest is not obviously in the growth, the sort of moral growth and learning of the slave. The master just wants to extract as much work and as much profit from the slave as possible. So there's no joining of interests. There's no idea of growth here, right? This is an idea of exploitation, where the person in authority simply wants to use the other person who's subject to their authority for their own needs, rather than the sort of growth, the sort of intrinsic needs for growth and learning of the person subject to authority themselves. So cases like that for Fromm are always cases of exploitation, right? So as long as the authority is rational, everything's okay, and the authority is valid. But when it's an irrational authority, it becomes something for which we need to develop forms of disobedience, and we need to think about how to transform that authority. In practice, we might think these are kind of a sliding scale that excuse me, that sort of we don't meet maybe pure cases of rational and irrational authority. Maybe you'll agree to some extent that teacher-student is a sort of rational authority relationship. But where do work relationships fit in, supervisor and supervisee? This is what about doctor and patient? It sounds like a rational relationship. Where do we put that? So it's interesting to think about where other relationships that we're familiar with would fit. And it could be that we'd say, maybe we can see them on both sides of this, a lot of them on both sides of this divide, or they maybe have aspects of, both elements of rational authority. Hopefully, maybe there's sort of elements of irrational authority and exploitation as well. So Fromm raises the question here, why are we so willing to obey and to obey these sort of mass institutions in which we're sort of hierarchically ordered and arranged? So for Fromm, the problem is that obedience to a greater power, and that greater power could be a church, could be a state, it could be a public opinion, it could be a large family, makes us feel strong and less alone. So we feel part of a greater whole. In sort of giving up our individuality and becoming part of a whole, becoming part of a sort of religious group or a state, becoming part of a sort of powerful group that's bigger than us, we feel powerful and we feel stronger. So this is why for Fromm, to disobey takes courage. Only if a person has acquired the capacity to think and feel for himself can they say no to authority, right? So it takes this capacity to learn to think for ourselves and not be dependent on these larger institutions to do our thinking for us. So for Fromm, again, it's all about this process of individual growth that helps us acquire this capacity to think for ourselves, and thereby we become capable of saying no, of disobeying authorities that are exploitative and sort of asserting our own interests. So to sum up, we've seen that Fromm focuses on the importance of disobedience in general for human growth and development. So he's not making a narrow argument about breaking the law. He's making a very general argument about why disobedience is useful. So this gives us a nice kind of almost like a framework for thinking about disobedience, that it's a positive thing that promotes growth, especially in times where authorities are very kind of strict and large and hierarchical. We need to sort of recover this general principle of disobedience and how it enables us to sort of rediscover our humanity and our sort of need for transformation to bring about societies that are more in tune with our human needs. So he argues that human history, we can analogize human history. It's like an analogy to the growth of a single person from infant to maturity. In both cases, we become ourselves by learning to say no to authority. We become individuals, we grow by sort of throwing off authority, by separating from authority, learning to think for ourselves, developing our own ideals, our own values, and sort of learning to assert them on our own. So in both cases, it's the same process, that sort of opposition, resistance, saying no, are the things that lead to human growth. Fromm, and human growth is what promotes self-fulfillment and general happiness.